The marriage contract hit the mahogany desk with a sound that echoed through Ethan Sullivan's penthouse office like a gunshot. His mother's pearls caught the amber light of the Manhattan sunset as she stood before him, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "The Blackwood girl is perfect for you," Eleanor Sullivan said, her voice carrying the same authority that had built their real estate empire. "Intelligent, well-bred, and her father's shipping connections will complement our portfolio beautifully." Ethan's fingers tightened around his whiskey glass until his knuckles turned white. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below him like a kingdom he was born to inherit but never chose to rule. At 32, he had everything. Except the one thing that mattered most: freedom. "I'm not marrying Victoria Blackwood," he said, his voice deadly calm. Eleanor's laugh was crystalline and cold. "Don't be ridiculous, darling. You've had your fun playing the bachelor, but it's time to think about legacy, about duty." The word duty landed like a physical blow. Ethan had heard it his entire life, wrapped around every decision his mother made for him: which schools to attend, which friends were suitable, which career path would best serve the family name. Now she wanted to choose his wife too. "I'm already married." The lie escaped his lips before he could stop it, born from desperation and whiskey courage. Eleanor's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine shock before her features hardened into something resembling fury. "Excuse me?" Ethan stood, moving to the window to buy himself time. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing a life he'd never live, choices he'd never make. "Her name is Emily. We've been keeping it quiet. That's impossible. I would have known." "Not everything revolves around your social network, Mother." He turned back to face her, surprised by how easy the deception felt. "We wanted privacy, something you've never understood." Eleanor's eyes narrowed to slits. "Prove it." The challenge hung in the air between them like a blade. Ethan's mind raced through his options, all of them terrible. He could confess the lie, submit to the arranged marriage, and spend the rest of his life as his mother's puppet. Or he could double down on the biggest gamble of his life. "You'll meet her at the foundation gala next week." After Eleanor left, her threats and ultimatums still ringing in his ears, Ethan collapsed into his chair and stared at his phone. He had 7 days to find a wife. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if his entire future wasn't hanging. In the balance, by midnight, he'd made 3 calls. The first to his lawyer, the second to his assistant, and the third to a discreet agency that specialized in what they euphemistically called social arrangements. Money, it turned out, could buy almost anything, even a wife. Emily Harper's rent notice lay on her kitchen table like an accusation. "Past due, final notice?" The words seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the dim light of her studio apartment. She'd been staring at it for an hour, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Her mother's treatment was progressing well, but the bills were mounting faster than Emily could pay them. The tutoring jobs that had sustained her through graduate school barely covered groceries now, let alone medical expenses and rent in Brooklyn. The laptop screen glowed as she refreshed the job boards for the 100th time that day. Most postings were the same: low pay, long hours, no benefits. Then one caught her eye, buried in the classified section of a forum she'd never seen before. "Seeking educated professional woman for unique 6-month arrangement. Discretion essential. Compensation substantial." The vagueness should have been a red flag, but the mention of substantial compensation made her fingers hover over the keyboard. How substantial? What kind of arrangement? The rational part of her mind screamed warnings, but desperation had a way of drowning out reason. She clicked on the posting. The details were sparse but intriguing. No photo required, just basic information and references. The pay figure, when it finally appeared after she'd filled out the initial form, made her hands shake. 6 months of this arrangement would pay off her mother's medical bills, her own student loans, and leave enough for a security deposit on a decent apartment. Emily stared at the screen until her eyes burned. Whatever this was, it felt like salvation wrapped in uncertainty. She'd always been careful, Always played it safe. Look where that had gotten her. She hit send before she could change her mind. The coffee shop on the Upper East Side was the kind of place where a single drink cost more than Emily usually spent on groceries in a day. She'd arrived 20 minutes early, using the time to study the man she was supposed to meet through the window. Ethan Sullivan looked exactly like his photos, tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to check a price tag. He wore his expensive suit-like armor, and when he looked up from his phone to scan the room, his blue eyes were calculating and cold. Emily's first instinct was to run. Instead, she walked through the door, her chin raised despite the fact that her entire outfit probably cost less than his watch. He recognized her immediately, which meant he'd done his research too. Miss Harper. He stood as she approached, extending a hand that was warm and surprisingly calloused. Thank you for coming, Mr. Sullivan. She shook his hand briefly, noting how his gaze assessed her like she was a business acquisition. Though I have to admit I still don't understand what kind of arrangement you're proposing. He gestured for her to sit, then settled across from her with fluid grace. It's quite simple, actually. I need a wife. You need money. I'm suggesting we help each other. The words hit her like cold water. A wife, in name only, of course. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. 6 months. You'd live in my penthouse, attend social functions, and play the part of the devoted spouse. In return, you'd receive full payment up front and enough to set you up quite comfortably afterward. Emily's mouth went dry. Why me? Why not someone from your own social circle? For the first time, his composed mask slipped slightly. Because everyone in my social circle has their own agenda. You don't know me, don't want anything from me except money, and have no reason to complicate things with emotional attachments. The clinical way he said it made her skin crawl, but she couldn't deny the logic. She also couldn't deny the number he slid across the table, written on a piece of Sullivan Enterprises letterhead. This is insane, she whispered. Probably. He leaned back, studying her reaction. But it's also mutually beneficial. You get financial security, I get my freedom. Simple transaction. Emily stared at the number until it burned into her retinas. With this money, she could save her mother, finish her doctorate, maybe even start the nonprofit she'd always dreamed of. All she had to do was pretend to love a man who clearly saw her as nothing more than a business deal. What's the catch? His smile was sharp as broken glass. My mother will try to destroy you. The media will dissect your entire life. And if anyone discovers this is fake, both our reputations will be ruined. That's it. That's enough. Emily closed her eyes, thinking of her mother's tired face, the pile of bills on her table, the dreams she'd put on hold. When she opened, Ethan was watching her with something that might have been respect. When do we start? Tomorrow. I'll have the contracts drawn up tonight. He signaled for the check, then paused. One more thing, Miss Harper. Once we begin this charade, there's no backing out. Are you certain you can handle 6 months of being Mrs. Ethan Sullivan? The way he said his own name suggested he could. Barely handle being Ethan Sullivan himself. Emily looked into his cold blue eyes and saw something she recognized. A person trapped by circumstances beyond their control, making impossible choices to survive. I'm certain, she lied.
Either
Of them mentioned how icily the deception came, or how natural it felt to conspire against the world that had trapped them both. They shook hands like business partners, but as Emily walked back into the New York night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just signed away more than 6 months of her life. She'd signed away her heart's ability to distinguish between performance and reality. And somewhere in his penthouse tower, Ethan Sullivan was discovering that the most dangerous lies were the ones that felt like truth. The Sullivan Foundation Gala transformed the Metropolitan Museum into a glittering fortress of Manhattan's elite. Emily stood before the mirror in Ethan's penthouse, barely recognizing herself in the midnight blue gown that had cost more than her annual salary. The woman staring back at her looked sophisticated, confident, nothing like the struggling graduate student who'd signed a devil's bargain 3 days ago. You clean up well? Ethan's reflection appeared behind hers, immaculate in his black tuxedo. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of coaching sessions, wardrobe fittings and crash courses in Sullivan family history. They'd practiced their love story until it felt almost real. "Flattery will get you everywhere," Emily replied, surprised by how easily the banter came, while she turned to face him, noting how his usual coldness seemed to intensify before public appearances. "Ready to convince the world we're madly in love? Are you?" The question caught her off guard. In the soft light of his bedroom, with the city sprawling beyond the windows, he looked almost vulnerable, almost human. "I'm a quick study," she said instead of answering. The museum steps were lined with photographers, their flashes creating a constellation of artificial stars. Emily's hand trembled slightly as it rested on Ethan's arm, but his steady presence beside her was unexpectedly reassuring. He moved through the crowd like he owned it, which, in many ways, he did. "Ethan," a woman's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. Eleanor Sullivan approached them with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood in the water. Though she was smaller than Emily had expected, but her presence filled the space around her like a gathering storm. "Mother." Ethan's arm tightened almost imperceptibly under Emily's hand. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Emily." Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her grip firm and assessing.
"How delightful."
"I've been simply dying to meet the woman who captured my son's heart so completely that he forgot to mention her existence." "The feeling is mutual," Emily replied, matching Eleanor's smile with one of her own. "Ethan speaks of you often, does he?" Eleanor's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or malice. "How fascinating. You must tell me all about how you two met. I find myself quite curious about the details." The story they'd rehearsed felt suddenly flimsy under Eleanor's penetrating gaze. Emily was acutely aware of every eye in the room turning toward them, the subtle shift. In conversation, as society's most prominent members strained to hear every word, "We met at a charity auction," Emily said, her voice steady, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I was there representing a literacy program I volunteer with. Ethan bid on a weekend at my favorite bookstore. How romantic." Eleanor's tone suggested she found it anything but. And this was when, exactly. 8 months ago, Ethan interjected smoothly, his hand moving to the small of Emily's back. The touch sent an unexpected spark of heat through her, which she hoped didn't show on her face, kept things private initially. Emily values her independence. Independence. Eleanor repeated the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "How modern of you, dear. I do hope you'll find time in your busy schedule to attend our family dinner this Sunday. I'm eager to get to know you better." It wasn't a request. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, carefully orchestrated conversations, and the constant awareness of being watched. Emily found herself impressed by Ethan's performance. He was attentive without being clingy, protective without being possessive. And when he looked at her, there were moments when she almost believed the affection in his eyes was real. "You're a natural," he murmured during a brief moment of privacy, his breath warm against her ear as they swayed on the dance floor. "So are you." She looked up at him, noting the way the chandelier light caught the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "Though I'm starting to wonder which version of you is the real one." Something flickered across his features, too quick to interpret. "Does it matter?" Before she could answer, they were interrupted by a woman Emily recognized from the society. Pages. Victoria Blackwood was everything Eleanor had probably hoped for in a daughter-in-law tall. It's elegant, with the kind of pedigree that opened doors and closed deals. "Ethan." Victoria's smile was perfect, practiced, and didn't reach her eyes. "I was so surprised to hear about your marriage. How wonderfully impulsive of you, Victoria." Ethan's arm tightened around Emily's waist. "Congratulations on your engagement to the Morrison boy. I'm sure you'll be very happy." "Thank you." Victoria's gaze shifted to Emily, assessing and dismissive. "You're not what I expected." "I get that a lot," Emily replied with a smile that had more teeth than warmth. Later, in the car ride home, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Emily stared out at the city lights, processing the evening's revelations. The performance had been flawless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "Your mother hates me," she said finally. "She hates everyone." Ethan's hands were relaxed on the steering wheel, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "But she's suspicious, which is worse." The dinner invitation. A test. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "She have done a background check by then. Every detail of your life will be under scrutiny." Emily's stomach clenched. What if she finds something? She won't. His confidence was reassuring until he added, "Because there's nothing to find, is there?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to address. Emily thought about her mother's medical bills, her carefully crafted resume, the small lies she'd told to make herself seem more suitable for this role. "No," she said. "Nothing important. They were both lying, and they both knew it." Back at the penthouse, Emily kicked off her heels and wandered to the windows, still in her expensive gown. The city looked different from this height, more like a vast circuit board than a place where real people lived and struggled. "Thank you," Ethan said from behind her. "For tonight. You were perfect. I was well compensated." She turned to face him, noting how he'd loosened his bow tie and rolled up his sleeves. He looked more approachable this way, less like a photograph and more like a person. Still, he moved closer, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine. "I know this isn't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." They stood there in the soft light, the weight of their shared deception settling around them like a shroud. Emily found herself studying his face, looking for cracks in the mask he wore so effortlessly. What she found instead was exhaustion, and something that might have been loneliness. "I ask you something," she said. "You can ask." "Why did you really choose me? And don't say it's because I have no agenda. Everyone has an agenda." Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Gosh, when I looked at your photo, you were the only one who looked real." The honesty in his words caught her off guard. For a moment, the space between them felt charged with possibility, with the dangerous promise of something genuine growing in the fertile ground of their shared pretense. Then his phone buzzed with a text, and the moment shattered like glass, hitting concrete. "Eleanor," he said, reading the message. "She wants to meet for lunch tomorrow." "Just the two of you." Emily's blood ran cold. "What do I tell her?" "The truth." His smile was sharp and humorless.
"Just make sure it's the right version of it."
As Emily walked to her room, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. Woman staring back at her was a stranger, elegant, composed, wearing a gown worth more than her car. But her eyes were the same, and in them she could see the fear she'd been hiding all evening. She was falling into this role too easily, and the most terrifying part wasn't that she was lying to Eleanor Sullivan and the entire New York elite. It was that she was starting to lie to herself about why she'd really agreed to this arrangement. And judging by the way Ethan had looked at her on the dance floor, she wasn't the only one discovering that some performances became indistinguishable from reality. Eleanor Sullivan chose La Bernardine for their lunch, a power move disguised as hospitality. Emily arrived 10 minutes early, her palms damp despite the October chill that had settled over Manhattan. She'd spent the morning rehearsing answers. 2 questions that felt like landmines, each one capable of destroying the careful fiction she and Ethan had constructed. "Emily, darling." Eleanor appeared at the mater d's elbow, like a materialization of expensive perfume and barely contained menace. She was dressed in Chanel, every detail calculated to remind Emily exactly who held the power in this relationship. "You look lovely. Though that dress is quite bold for lunch, don't you think?" Emily glanced down at her navy sheath dress, purchased from a department store with money from her first payment. In Eleanor's world, it probably screamed middle-class pretender, but she lifted her chin anyway. "I've always believed in making an impression," she replied. Indeed, Eleanor's smile could have frozen champagne. "Shall we?" The meal proceeded like an interrogation disguised as small talk. Eleanor dissected Emily's childhood in Rochester, her education at Syracuse, and her work as a tutor. Each question felt designed to expose the cracks in her carefully constructed persona. "And your parents?" Eleanor asked, delicately cutting her Dover soul. Ethan mentioned your father passed away when you were young, when I was 15. Emily's throat tightened at the memory, real grief bleeding through her performance. Heart attack. My mother raised me alone. How challenging that must have been. Eleanor's sympathy felt as genuine as plastic flowers. She must be so proud of your marriage to Ethan. I assume she's met him. The question hit like a physical blow. Emily's mother, Sarah, was in the final stages of treatment at Mount Sinai, her world reduced to hospital rooms and medication schedules. She knew nothing about Emily's arrangement with Ethan, nothing about the money that was paying for her care. She's been ill, Emily said carefully. We're keeping things quiet until she's stronger, of course. Eleanor set down her fork with surgical precision, though I do hope we'll meet her soon. Family is so important, don't you think? The threat was delicately wrapped but unmistakable. Eleanor would dig until she found something, and Emily's mother's medical records would be just the beginning. Mrs. Sullivan, Emily said, setting down her own fork and meeting the older woman's gaze directly. I know you don't approve of me. Whatever. Gave you that impression? The fact that you've spent the last hour trying to find a reason to have this marriage annulled? Emily leaned forward slightly, channeling every ounce of confidence she'd learned from watching Ethan navigate these social waters. But I love your son, and he loves me. Nothing you uncover is going to change that. For the first time since they'd sat down, Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression shifted into something that might have been respect. You have spine, she said finally. I'll give you that. I have too. Your son isn't an easy man to love, the words surprised Emily as much as they did Eleanor. They'd slipped out with the ring of truth, and she realized with dawning horror that they weren't entirely false. No, Eleanor agreed, her voice softer than it had been all afternoon. He's not. His father was the same way. He's brilliant, driven, and absolutely convinced that everyone around him had ulterior motives. Did they? Eleanor's laugh was genuinely amused. Usually, yes, but not always. She studied Emily with new interest. Tell me, what do you see when you look at my son? The honest answer would have ended everything. Emily saw a man trapped by expectations, performing a role that was slowly suffocating him. She saw loneliness disguised as arrogance, vulnerability hidden behind wealth and power. She saw someone who'd forgotten how to trust genuine affection, because he'd been surrounded by people who wanted something from him his entire life. She also saw someone she was beginning to care about more than their contract allowed. I see the man I fell in love with, she said instead. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if Emily had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Good, because if you hurt him, I'll destroy you so completely, you'll wish you'd never been born. The threat was delivered with the same tone Eleanor might use to comment on the weather, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Emily returned to the penthouse to find Ethan in his study, surrounded by contracts and looking like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was rumpled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and there was something almost vulnerable about the way he hunched over his desk. How did it go? He asked without looking up. Your mother threatened to destroy me if I hurt you. Emily sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly exhausted. I think that means I passed. Eleanor doesn't make idle threats, neither do I. He finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the same expression she'd glimpsed at the gala when he'd said she looked real, raw, unguarded. Emily. He leaned back in his chair, and she noticed the way her name sounded different when he said it now. Less formal, more intimate. There's something you need to know. Before he could continue, his phone rang. The caller ID made his jaw tighten visibly. James? Ethan's voice was carefully neutral, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders. What's wrong? She couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Ethan's face go pale, then flush with anger. When? A pause. How bad? Another pause, longer this time. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and was already reaching for his jacket before Emily could ask what was happening. I have to go, he said, his movements sharp and urgent. There's been an accident at one of our construction sites. 3 workers are in the hospital. I'll come with you. No. The word came out harsher than he'd probably intended because his expression immediately softened. "This isn't going to be pleasant. Stay here, Ethan." She caught his arm as he moved toward the door. "Whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to do it alone anymore. Isn't that what wives are for?" He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. It's a part of him that had learned never to trust any own waswaring with something newer, more fragile. "The media will be there," he said finally. "It'll be a circus. Then you'll need someone in your corner." 20 minutes later, they arrived at the construction site in Lower Manhattan to find exactly the chaos Ethan had predicted. News vans lined the street, reporters thrust microphones at anyone in a Sullivan Enterprises hard hat, and the air crackled with the kind of predatory energy that surrounded tragedy in New York. Emily watched Ethan transform before her eyes. The vulnerability she'd glimpsed in his study vanished, replaced by the polished, unshakable facade of a CEO in crisis mode. But she could see the cracks in his armor, the way his hands trembled, slightly as he straightened his tie. "Mr. Sullivan," reporter broke from the pack, camera crew in tow. "Can you comment on reports that Sullivan Enterprises cut corners on safety protocols to meet construction deadlines?" Emily felt Ethan stiffen beside her, but his voice remained perfectly controlled. "Our first priority is the well-being of our workers. We're cooperating fully with the investigation and will take whatever steps necessary to ensure this never happens again. But what about the allegations that you personally approved cost-cutting measures that no further questions?" Ethan said firmly, guiding Emily toward the site entrance. Inside the construction trailer that served as the on-site office, Emily finally saw the man behind the mask. Ethan slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked utterly defeated. "They're right," he said quietly. "I approved the budget cuts. I signed off on the revised safety protocols. Those men are in the hospital because I chose profit margins over people." Emily knelt beside his chair, her hand finding his arm without conscious thought. "Tell me what happened." "James Henderson, my site manager, came to me 6 months ago. Said we were over budget, behind schedule, the investors were getting nervous." Ethan's voice was hollow, mechanical. "He presented 2 options. We could push back the deadline and eat the penalties, or we could streamline some of the safety protocols. Nothing dangerous," he said, "just redundancies, and you trusted him." "I trusted the numbers." He looked at her then, and she saw something breaking behind his eyes. "I didn't even visit the site. Just looked at spreadsheets and profit projections and made a decision that put people's lives at risk. You couldn't have known I should have known." He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the construction site. "This is what happens when you let other people make your decisions for you. When you're so busy playing a role that you forget there are real consequences to your choices." Emily understood then that he wasn't just talking about the construction site. He was talking about their arrangement, about the life he'd been living, about the careful performance that had become indistinguishable from reality. "What are you going to do? Take responsibility." His reflection in the window looked like a stranger. "Fire Henderson. Implement new safety protocols. Set up a fund for the injured workers and their families, and if it costs you everything," he turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile was completely genuine. "Then at least I'll know I did the right thing." Standing in that cramped trailer, surrounded by the evidence of corporate negligence and human cost, Emily realized she was witnessing Ethan's transformation from the man. His mother had shaped him to be into the man he actually was. It was messy and painful and beautiful. And she found herself falling for him in ways that had nothing to do with their contract. "We should get back," he said finally. "The media feeding frenzy is just getting started," as they prepared to face the cameras again. Emily caught his hand and squeezed it gently. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, even if it ruins us both." She thought about her mother in the hospital, about the money that was paying for her treatment, about the future she'd thought this arrangement would secure. Then she looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw someone worth more than all of it. "Especially then," she said. But as they walked back into the chaos of flashing cameras and shouted questions, Neither of them noticed the figure in the expensive coat watching from across the street, or the way Eleanor Sullivan's expression shifted, from concern to something far more calculating as she observed her son and his wife facing their first real crisis together. The game was changing, and Eleanor had never been one to play by other people's rules. The scandal broke 3 days later with the subtlety of a wrecking ball through glass. Emily woke to find Ethan's penthouse surrounded by news vans. The morning papers spread across his kitchen island like accusations.
Lies.
The headlines were brutal. Sullivan heir's secret marriage exposed, from fake wife to real scandal, and most damaging of all, the $2 million deception. Ethan stood at the windows in his pajama pants and rumpled dress shirt from the night before, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the media circus below. He looked like he hadn't slept, which Emily realized he probably hadn't. "How did they find out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother." His tone was matter-of-fact, but she could see the betrayal in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man expecting another blow. "She hired a private investigator after your lunch. Found your original apartment, your tutoring clients, the agency that connected us." Emily sank onto the couch, the reality of their exposure hitting her like physical weight. The workers from the construction site are still in the hospital. Ethan's reflection in the window looked ghostly, insubstantial. 2 of them have families, kids, and now this story is overshadowing their recovery, turning their pain into a sideshow for our pathetic little charade. The self-loathing in his voice made her chest ache. She wanted to go to him, to offer comfort. But the morning light streaming through the windows revealed the full magnitude of what they'd done. The lies they'd told weren't just to Eleanor and New York society, they'd been lying to themselves. "Ethan, don't." He turned from the window, and she saw that his usual composure had cracked completely. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, and there was something wild in his expression that made her pulse race with equal parts fear and recognition. "Just don't." We both knew this was unsustainable. Did we? The question escaped before she could stop it, loaded with 3 weeks of careful pretense and growing feelings neither of them had acknowledged. "Because I'm not sure I did." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something that went far deeper than their current crisis. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with exhaustion, and something that sounded dangerously like honesty. "The construction site wasn't the first time I've made a decision based on numbers instead of people. My entire life has been a series of calculated moves designed to maximize profit and minimize risk." He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne mixed with coffee and the faint scent of stress sweat. "Including you, I know. Do you?" He was close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, the fine lines that spoke of too many late nights and too much pressure. "Because I hired you to solve a problem, Emily. I reduced you to a line item in my budget, a prop in my performance. And the worst part is, it worked so well that I started believing it myself." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Emily found herself studying his face, looking for the cold, calculating man she'd met in that coffee shop 3 weeks ago. He was still there, but layered underneath was someone she was only beginning to understand. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between my mother's threats and your lunch date with Eleanor, between the gala and the construction site, this stopped being about the money." His hand lifted toward her face, then dropped as if he'd remembered they were just business partners, at least for me.
Nice.
The words hit her like lightning, illuminating truths she'd been hiding from herself since the moment she'd stepped into his penthouse. The way her heart raced when he looked at her ain't the protective anger she'd felt watching him shoulder the blame for the construction accident. The growing certainty that their carefully constructed fiction had become the most real thing in her life. Ethan, her phone rang, shattering the moment like glass against stone. Caller ID made her blood run cold. Mount Sinai Hospital. "Mom," Emily answered on the first ring, her voice tight with panic. "Emily, honey?" Her mother's voice was weak, but familiar, and Emily felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "I'm watching the news." What's all this about you being married? Emily closed her eyes, the weight of her deception crashing down on her like a collapsed building. She'd been so careful to keep her mother insulated from this arrangement. Visiting during her tutoring hours, spinning stories about new clients, and better pay. Now, Sarah Harper was learning about her daughter's marriage from the morning news. Mom, I can explain. The reporters are calling me Emily. They want to know about your husband, about why I wasn't at your wedding. Sarah's voice grew stronger, edged with the steel that had carried her through widowhood and single motherhood. They're saying you were paid to marry him, that it's all fake. Emily glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, desperate to escape after weeks of careful containment. It started that way, she said finally. But Mom, it's complicated. Come see me now and bring him with you. The line went dead. Emily stared at her phone, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. In her peripheral vision, she saw Ethan reaching for his jacket. We don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can handle the media fallout myself. You can disappear. Start over somewhere else. The money I paid you will cover my mother's medical bills. Emily stood, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. That was the deal. The deal is void now. Everything's public. She looked at him standing there, with his expensive jacket and haunted eyes, offering her an escape that would destroy him and save her. The old Emily, the careful one who'd always chosen safety over risk, would have taken it without hesitation. My mother wants to meet you, she said instead. Something flickered across his features that might have been hope or terror. Emily, she's dying, Ethan. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but they were true and they needed to be said. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The treatments are experimental, expensive, and they're probably just buying us time. But they're buying us time, and that's worth every lie I've told. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. How long have you known? 6 months, since before I answered your ad. She moved to the window, looking down at the media circus that had consumed their morning. I would have done anything to save her, including marrying a stranger and pretending to love him, and now? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with 3 weeks of shared glances and growing intimacy. Emily thought about the man who'd taken responsibility for the construction accident, who'd shown vulnerability in his study, who'd looked at her like she was the only real thing in his carefully constructed world. Now I'm not sure what's pretending. Any more Mount Sinai hospitals smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Emily held Ethan's hand as they walked through the corridors. Partly for show and partly because she needed the comfort of human contact. The media had followed them to the hospital entrance before being turned away by security. But their presence lingered like smoke. Sarah Harper was sitting up in her bed when they arrived, looking far more alert than Emily had expected. The months of treatment had carved hollows in her cheeks and stolen the color from her hair, but her eyes were sharp and assessing as they fixed on Ethan. So, she said without preamble, you're the billionaire who bought my daughter. Ethan didn't flinch. From the accusation, Mrs. Harper, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, are you? Sarah's gaze moved between them, cataloging details Emily wasn't sure she wanted her mother to see. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you both got exactly what you wanted. Mom. Sit down, both of you. Sarah's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd raised a child alone and faced down cancer with equal determination. Emily, the reporters who called this morning seemed to think they knew everything about your arrangement. Money, duration, terms, but they didn't know why. Emily perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, acutely aware of Ethan settling beside her. I told you, it's complicated. Complicated how? Sarah's attention shifted to Ethan. You needed a wife to avoid an arranged marriage. She needed money for my medical bills. Sounds straightforward to me. It was, Ethan said quietly, at the beginning. And now. Millet watched her mother and the man she'd married for money study each other with the wariness of two predators meeting at a watering hole. Sarah had always been an excellent judge of character, a skill honed by years of interviewing potential tenants for their duplex and screening. Emily's boyfriends with maternal precision. Now, Sarah continued when neither of them answered, you're holding hands like it means something. Emily's wearing a wedding ring that costs more than our house, and she's looking at you like you hung the moon. So I'll ask again, what's complicated? Emily glanced down, surprised to see that she was indeed wearing the platinum band Ethan had given her for public appearances. More surprising was that she'd stopped thinking of it as a prop weeks ago. The feelings are real, Emily said finally. But the circumstances that brought us together aren't exactly the foundation for a lasting relationship. Why not? The question came from Ethan, and both women turned to stare at him. He was leaning forward slightly, his expression more open than Emily had ever seen it. Because Emily said, her voice catching slightly, how do we know what's real and what's performance? How do we trust something that started with a lie? How does anyone know? Sarah interjected, her tone gentler now. Your father and I met at a bar. He was trying to impress his friends. Andy was trying to make my ex-boyfriend jealous. It's not exactly a fairy tale beginning. That's different, is it? Sarah's eyes moved between them again, and Emily could see her mother's quick mind working. Emily, honey, I've watched you date for years. Nice boys, safe boys, boring boys who never challenged you or made you think twice about your comfortable little life. This man, she nodded toward Ethan, makes you uncomfortable. I can see it in the way you look at him. Uncomfortable isn't necessarily good, isn't it? Sarah smiled, and for a moment, Emily glimpsed the woman she'd been before illness and loss. Had carved new lines in her face. The best things in life make us uncomfortable. They force us to grow, to become versions of ourselves we didn't know existed. Emily felt Ethan's gaze on her, but couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. What if we're just fooling ourselves? What if this is just some kind of Stockholm syndrome between captor and captive? You're both victims, Sarah said pragmatically. And maybe that's not the worst foundation for understanding each other. A long silence settled over the room, broken only by the steady beep of Sarah's heart monitor and the distant sounds of hospital life. Emily found herself studying her mother's hands, thin and marked with 4 bruises, but still strong, still capable of comfort. Mrs. Harper, Ethan said finally, his voice carefully controlled. I want you to know that regardless of how this situation resolves, your medical expenses will continue to be covered. Emily fulfilled her part of our agreement, and I honor my contracts. Sarah's laugh was dry, but not unkind. You're missing the point, son. It stopped being about contracts the moment you walked into this room holding my daughter's hand like you were afraid she might disappear. Emily looked at their joined hands, realizing Sarah was right. Ethan's grip was firm, possessive, and entirely unconscious. When had that happened? When had the performance become so natural that they no longer noticed they were giving it? Media will crucify us both, Emily said softly. Your reputation, your business, will survive or they won't. Ethan's thumb traced across her knuckles. A gesture so small and intimate, it made her breath catch. I'm tired of making decisions based on other people's expectations, even if it costs you everything. What everything? It was something. Almost desperate in his voice now. A company that was built on my father's dreams instead of my own. A social circle that sees me as a bank account with a pulse. A mother who loves the idea of me more than the reality. He turned to face her fully, and Emily saw all his careful defenses crumbling in real time. Emily, for the first time in my life, I'm making a choice based on what I want instead of what I should want. And what I want is to find out if this thing between us can survive in the real world without contracts and time limits and financial incentives. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Emily felt Sarah watching them with the intensity of someone who understood that pivotal moments often came disguised as ordinary conversations in hospital rooms. And if it can't, Emily whispered, then at least we'll know we tried. No, Sarah cleared, her throat softly, reminding them they had an audience. Emily, honey, I didn't raise you to be a coward. I'm not, aren't you? Her mother's smile was knowing and sad. You've spent your whole life choosing safety over possibility. Safe job, safe apartment, safe boyfriends, who would never ask you to risk anything that mattered. Now you have a chance. To choose something that scares you, and you're looking for reasons to run. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, because Sarah was right, and they both knew it. What if I get hurt? What if you don't? Ethan's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. What if we figure out how to build something real from this mess we've made? Before Emily could answer, Sarah's heart monitor began beeping more rapidly. They all turned toward the machine, watching the numbers spike as Sarah clutched her chest, her breathing becoming labored. "Get the doctor," Emily said, her voice sharp with panic as she reached for the call button. No, Sarah's grip on Emily's wrist was surprisingly strong. "Just listen to me, both of you. Life is short and unpredictable and unfair. If you have a chance at happiness, you take it, regardless of how it started or where it might lead." She looked directly at Ethan, her voice growing weaker, but more intense. "Take care of her. Not because of your contract or your guilt, but because she deserves someone who sees what I see when I look at her." "What do you see?" Ethan asked quietly. "Someone brave enough to sacrifice everything for the people she loves?" Sarah's eyes moved to Emily, and someone foolish enough to think she doesn't deserve the same kind of sacrifice in return. The monitors. Beeping slowed gradually, returning to its normal rhythm. But the weight of Sarah's words lingered in the room like a benediction or a curse as they prepared to leave. Emily realized that something fundamental had shifted during their hospital visit. The careful boundaries they'd maintained, the professional distance that had made their arrangement bearable, had crumbled under the weight of honesty and her mother's unflinching assessment of their situation. Walking back through the hospital corridors, their hands still joined, Emily found herself wondering if Sarah was right. If the best things in life were the ones that made you uncomfortable, that forced you to become someone you didn't recognize. And if so, what kind of person? Was she becoming under Ethan Sullivan's influence? The answer, she suspected, was someone brave enough to find out. Eleanor Sullivan was waiting in the penthouse when they returned from the hospital, her presence as commanding as a storm front moving across clear skies. She sat in Ethan's chair behind his desk, a queen surveying her kingdom, with legal documents spread before her like battle plans. "Mother." Ethan's voice held no surprise, only weary resignation. "I should have known you'd let yourself in. I've always had a key, darling." Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "We need to talk." Emily started toward the guest room, seeking escape from what promised to be an ugly confrontation, but Eleanor's voice stopped her cold. "Stay, dear. This concerns you as well." The documents on the desk were dissolution papers, Emily realized with growing dread. Annulment forms, settlement agreements, a carefully constructed legal framework designed to erase their marriage as completely as if it had never existed. "Sign these," Eleanor said without preamble, "and the scandal dies tonight." "I've already spoken to the major news outlets. They're prepared to run a story about young love, family disapproval, and a reconciliation that proves even the most unconventional beginnings can lead to happiness. At what cost?" Ethan moved to the windows, his reflection ghostly in the afternoon light. "You divorce Miss Harper, marry Victoria Blackwood, as originally planned?" And the construction site incident becomes a footnote instead of a headline. Eleanor's tone suggested she was offering them a gift instead of an ultimatum. Emily receives a generous settlement, enough to ensure her mother's continued care and her own comfortable future. Emily felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. The offer was everything she'd dreamed of when she'd first answered Ethan's ad. Financial security, her mother's medical bills covered. Freedom from the suffocating pretense that had consumed the last month of her life. "How generous?" she asked, hating herself for the question but needing to know. Eleanor named a figure that made Emily's knees weak. It was enough to buy her mother the best care available, to secure experimental treatments that might actually save her life, to give Emily the freedom to pursue her doctorate without the crushing weight of financial desperation. "All she has to do is disappear," Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on Emily with laser precision. "Change her name, move somewhere far from New York, and never speak to the media about her arrangement with Ethan." "What about the investigation into the construction accident?" Emily found her voice, though it sounded foreign to her own ears. "We'll proceed as planned. Ethan will take full responsibility, implement new safety protocols, and the Sullivan name will recover." Eleanor leaned back in the chair, confident in her victory. "Everyone gets what they need. Accept each other," Ethan said quietly. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Emily saw something flicker. In her eyes, that might have been regret or recognition. "Ethan, darling, surely you can't believe this infatuation is worth destroying everything your father built." Leonor's voice softened, taking on the tone she'd probably used when he was a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. "She's lovely, truly, but she's not from our world. The differences between you will only become more apparent with time." "What differences?" Ethan turned from the window, his face hard with an anger Emily had never seen before. "That she works for her money instead of inheriting it? That she cares more about her mother's welfare than social appearances? That she's willing to sacrifice her own happiness for people she loves? That she answered an advertisement to marry a stranger?" Eleanor shot back, her composure cracking slightly. "That she's been lying to everyone, including you, about her motivations and feelings? We've all been lying." Emily stepped forward, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "You lied about accepting Ethan's choices. You lied about being married. I lied about loving him." The past tense hung in the air between them, loaded with implications none of them wanted to address directly. And now, Eleanor's question was directed at Emily, but her eyes never left her son's face. Emily looked at Ethan. Really looked at him, taking in the exhaustion around his eyes. The way he held himself like a man preparing for another blow, the careful distance he maintained even now. When everything was falling apart, she thought about the man who'd taken responsibility for the construction accident, who'd shown vulnerability in his study, who'd held her hand in the hospital like she was the only solid thing in his world. "Now I don't know what's real anymore," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to find out by running away." Eleanor's smile was bitter with what might have been disappointment or admiration. How romantic. And when the novelty wears off, you realize that love isn't enough to bridge the gap between your worlds. "Then we'll deal with it together," Ethan said. Moving to stand beside Emily, his hand found hers, fingers interlacing with the naturalness of habit, like married couples do. "You're not a married couple," Eleanor snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. "You're two people who made a business arrangement that spiraled out of control. Don't confuse desperation with destiny." "Maybe they're the same thing," Emily said quietly. "Maybe the best relationships start with people who need each other becoming. People who choose each other." Eleanor studied them for a long moment, her sharp mind working behind eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father said something similar once? About choosing love over logic, passion over practicality?" She stood slowly, gathering the unsigned documents with mechanical precision. "Told him he was being foolish, were you right?" Ethan asked. Eleanor's laugh was hollow, echoing with decades of regret. "He died believing I was wrong. I've spent the last 15 years wondering if he was right." She moved toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble with the finality of a closing chapter. At the threshold, she paused without turning. "Around. If you do this, if you choose each other over everything else, there's no going back. The company will suffer. Your social standing will never recover. The media will follow you for years, waiting for the fairy tale to end." "We know," Emily said. "Do you?" Eleanor turned back, and for the first time since Emily had met her, the older woman looked genuinely vulnerable, because loving someone isn't the same as being able to live with them. And Ethan has never been easy to love. "Neither have I," Emily replied, surprising them all with her honesty. "Maybe that's why this works." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if Emily had confirmed something she'd suspected all along. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." After she left, the penthouse felt different. Emptier and fuller at the same time, as if Eleanor's ultimatum had forced them to finally inhabit the space they'd been pretending to share. So Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral, "Where do we go from here?" Emily looked around the penthouse that had been her home for a month, taking in the expensive furniture and breathtaking views, the careful perfection that had never quite felt real. Through the windows, she could see the media vans still parked. On the street below, waiting for the next chapter of their story? "I don't know," she admitted. "The contract is void, the secret is out, and your mother just offered me enough money to disappear forever. Is that what you want?" the question was. Simple, but Emily knew her answer would determine the trajectory of both their lives. She thought about her mother's words in the hospital, about choosing courage over safety, about the difference between the life she'd planned and the life she was actually living. A month ago, yes, financial security and freedom were all I thought I wanted. She moved to the couch, where they'd shared late-night conversations and carefully orchestrated performances. But I've learned something about myself these past few weeks. What's that? I'm tired of playing it safe. She looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and perfect features to the man who'd held her during thunderstorms and made her laugh with terrible jokes and showed her that vulnerability could be a strength instead of a weakness. I'm tired of choosing what I should want instead of what I actually want. Emily took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea what lay at the bottom. I want to find out if we can build something real together, not because of contracts or money or other people's expectations, but because we choose to. Ethan's smile was soft and genuine, reaching his eyes for the first time since she'd known him, even if it means starting over, new apartment, new life, new rules, especially then. She moved closer, drawn by the warmth in his expression. Though I should probably mention that I have no idea how to be in a real relationship. All my previous boyfriends were safe choices who never challenged me to grow. I've never been in a real relationship either, he admitted. Just strategic partnerships disguised as romance. Then we'll figure it out together. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. Emily Harper, will you marry me? For real this time, for all the right reasons, and none of the wrong ones. We're already married, she pointed out, laughing despite the tears that had started falling without her permission. Then will you stay married to me? Through media scandals and family drama and whatever other disasters life throws at us? Emily thought about her mother's advice, about choosing discomfort over safety, about the difference between the person she'd been a month ago and the woman she was becoming under Ethan's influence. The old Emily would have asked for guarantees, for proof that their feelings were real and their future was secure. The new Emily, the one who'd answered a stranger's advertisement and pretended to love him until pretense became truth, knew that some risks were worth taking without guarantees. Yes, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him with all the passion and promise and terrifying hope she'd been holding back. Yes to all of it. Outside, the media circus continued its vigil, waiting for the next twist in a story they thought they understood. Inside the penthouse, two people who'd hired each other for a performance discovered that the best love stories often began with the worst possible circumstances. 6 months later, they would renew their vows in a small ceremony at Mount Sinai Hospital, with Sarah Harper looking on from her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face as her daughter and soon Heinel exchanged promises that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with choice. Eleanor Sullivan would attend, despite herself, wearing Chanel and carrying flowers she'd picked from her own garden, learning that sometimes the most unexpected matches were the ones that lasted longest. The media would eventually find other scandals to chase, other stories to sensationalize, leaving Ethan and Emily to build their life together in relative peace. But that was all in the future. For now, in the fading afternoon light of his penthouse, with the city sprawling below them like a promise of possibility, they had each other and the rare courage to choose love over logic, passion over practicality, and hope over fear. It was, they would discover, more than enough. The end.